My name is Ishtiak Ahmed, and I'm happy to be the presenter for the most part of this presentation. Our research topic for this webinar is addressing unpredictable sources of congestion. One of the presenters, Professor Andrew Sullivan, couldn't make it here, but he very smartly put his slide decks with his recorded voice. So for some part of the presentation, you will hear his presentation with his recorded voice. So let me get started. So non-recurrent congestion is a major source of unreliable travel times on the roads and is a major concern for traffic management schemes. If we look at the sources, different sources of non-recurrent congestion, incidents account for a significant portion of it. In fact, it accounts for 25% of the overall road congestion. So managing the incidents is really important for the public agencies. And currently, there are several popular strategies such as service patrol, advanced traveler information, traveler detours, and integrated corridor management. We will talk about in more detail about these strategies, but the main decision-making criteria here are like where and when to deploy these strategies because our resources are limited and we have a huge road network. Now, we could use the historical incident frequency data, and we can look at the delay induced by the incidents. And another metric that we could look at, which is called the rate of secondary crashes. And this is actually of particular importance for our research. So let me define what secondary crash is. So whenever a crash is happening on the road that is partly or fully attributed to a prior crash on the downstream side of the road, we call that a secondary crash. So it can happen, or it could have a causal relationship with another incident, which can be crash or non-crash, ahead in time. Now, why its rate is important for evaluating incident management strategies is because if a particular incident management strategy is very efficient about clearing the incidents, we were supposed to see a decrease in the rate of secondary crashes. However, the challenge here is that it's really difficult to identify or distinguish secondary crashes from isolated crash events. So this is one of our research focus. And the other one is that what other criteria can be included to improve the warrant for the incident management strategies. So keeping these research questions in our mind, we have set up these two objectives for this research project. One is to review the current practices of transportation agencies to manage unpredictable sources of congestion. And we limited our scope for this research toward freeways, and to develop frameworks to support the planning and monitoring of different mitigation strategies. And that objective can be subcategorized into two parts. One is to evaluate an existing strategy and test the need for additional criteria, and to develop and test a method for detecting potential secondary crashes. Now, here we are using the phrase potential because even if like two crashes are happening in quick succession and there were queue in between them, it's actually hard to say for certain that the second crash was attributed to the first crash because a lot of things can contribute to a crash occurrence, right? So that's why we are saying it's potential, because it's hard to say for sure that those are like, there is a causal relationship between them. So when we looked at the strategies that are currently in the field in the southeast region of the US, we found that for dealing with work zones, some of the most common strategies are driver communication systems through dynamic messaging and portable changeable messaging devices. And some states in this area also used variable speed limit and dynamic lane merging. For crashes or stalled vehicles, service patrols is one of the most common ones. And some states also use coordinated highway assistance and maintenance program and traffic incident management training track. For other events like some sort of concerts or special events, we see traffic signal retiming and all-way pedestrian crossing have been implemented. And for adverse weather or hurricane response, weather detection system, lane reversal, road detours, and hard shoulder use are some of the common ones. So of all these, in this study, we particularly look at the service patrols. And it was found to be very effective for all the traffic volume levels. And we go to the next slide. So we got a question here, will the presentation be available to download and view later? And the answer is yes. So if we look at the different service petrol programs run by different states, they have different names, but overall they serve the same purpose. We have a list of these different service petrol programs. In this research, we will particularly look at the Alabama Service Assistance Petrol, also called the ASAP method, and we will see if we can improve the decision criteria for deploying this strategy. And the other one that we look at is the IMIP strategy deployed by North Carolina. Overall, the common criteria for deploying the service petrol program includes combination of segment length, AADT, number of reported incidents, and in some cases, level of service, road geometry, and truck volumes. So in this research, we will see if we can detect secondary crashes so that in future that can be added as a criteria. And also we will see time of day and day of weeks effect, and if those can be added as criteria. So let me move on to the one of the research questions, which is the evaluating service petrols by Alabama DOT. And for this part of the presentation, I will start the recorded version of Professor Sullivan.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Sullivan, and I'm presenting UAV's portion of this project. After discussions with the Alabama DOT, we decided to focus our attention on the criteria used for the deployment of highway service patrols. Alabama DOT does operate a highway service patrol system, the ASAP system. If you look at the map on the right, the corridors highlighted in purple are corridors or highway segments where ALDOT operates the ASAP service. It's focused primarily on traffic incident management and motorist assistance, but they also do things like removing debris from the roadway and work zone management. The system's been very successful. A recent study in 2022 found that the ASAP patrols do in fact significantly reduce incident clearance times. And the study even made the recommendation that ALDOT extend the service patrols to all interstate corridors within the state. Which brings us to our study. The ALDOT currently uses a fairly simple criteria to determine where to deploy highway service patrols. It's called an incident factor, and it's basically the product of an AADT and the average number of annual crashes per mile divided by 100,000. And when this incident factor exceeds 4, it indicates that service patrols might be needed. ALDOT would like to expand this to provide a little more guidance, not only on where to provide service patrols, but also what times of day, what service frequencies are needed, what days of the week should the service patrols be provided, and particularly what would be the impact of freight movement. Alabama, like a lot of southern states, has a significant auto industry. So what is the impact of these freight movements in and out of these manufacturing corridors, and how should that affect the deployment decisions? What we wanted to do was use a combination of traffic count data and travel time data from the NPM RDS database in order to estimate actual traffic delays on interstate segments in a smaller study area. And then in particular, break that out into recurring congestion, non-recurring congestion. After all, the service patrols are aimed primarily at non-recurring congestion. And so we wanted to really look at how much non-recurring congestion was on these different interstate segments. And then using that, how does that compare to the actual deployment of service patrols that ALDOT currently has? So we chose a small study area in the northern part of the state around Huntsville, I-65 from the Tennessee state line down to south of Huntsville. It's primarily a rural interstate corridor. And then we also looked at the 565 spur, interstate spur into Huntsville, which is an urban corridor, much heavier traffic. ALDOT does currently operate service patrols on the I-565 segment, and then a very short portion, 565 from I-565 down to the Tennessee River. We wanted to look at the total non-recurring congestion delay over different days of the week, times of the day. And then we also wanted to use delay costs and use those to estimate what are the actual delay costs due to non-recurrent congestion on these different corridors, and how would service deployment look if we use that as the criteria. So we estimated using the NPN RDS database, we estimated total delay for each TMC link in our study area. And then we had to decide which portions were due to recurring congestion and which were non-recurring congestion. So we used a standard normal deviant method shown here. And basically for any TMC, if we computed in SND value negative 1.5 or less, it was an indication that non-recurring congestion was present on that link. Now, it didn't mean that all congestion was non-recurrent, but it didn't mean that at least some portion of it was non-recurring. It was present. So we used that to quantify at 15-minute intervals over a 3-month period, non-recurring congestion, the presence and quantity of non-recurring congestion on each TMC within the study area. Now, in places where we detected non-recurring congestion, one of the first things we did was try to assign it to a known cause, whether it be a work zone or a weather incident or a vehicle incident. So we looked at incident logs from the Transportation Management Center in Huntsville. We looked at weather records and service patrol logs and tried to assign each occurrence of non-recurring congestion to a different cause. Now, you look at the figure on the right, and that's for I-565, which is the urban spur. So 57% of the non-recurring congestion we detected in the data could be assigned to known reported incidents. 31% could be assigned to known maintenance activity, 3% to known weather events, which left about 9% of the total NRC, the non-recurrent delay we detected in the data, which we just couldn't assign to any known event. That's significant, and even more significant for I-65 segment. So there we had almost 36% of the non-recurrent congestion delay that we detected in the data could not be assigned to any known cause. And that's interesting because if you're using a deployment criteria that's dependent on reported incidents, it indicates you could be missing significant amounts of delay that are occurring on your network. In this case, somewhere between 9 and 36% of the delay would not be covered. So we think this was an important consideration when looking at deployment criteria. Here are a couple graphs looking at the distribution of the non-recurring congestion that we detected in the data by day of week. Again, starting on the right with I-565, probably a predictable distribution with the majority of non-recurring congestion occurring Monday through Friday, and much less so on the weekends, which seems to validate ALDOT's decision to deploy service patrols in this corridor only on Monday through Friday. They don't currently serve on weekends. The distribution was more random on I-65 in the rural areas, but then again, most of this does not have a service patrol at the moment. Then we looked at time of day. So again, let's start on the right, I-565, which is the urban corridor. This is a plot of non-recurring delay along the entire corridor. And you can see that, the vast majority of it, almost all of it occurs between the hours of 6 a.m. and roughly 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. And then this works well with what ALDOT is doing right now in this corridor with service patrols. ALDOT currently operates service patrols from 6 in the morning to 10 p.m. And that appears to cover the overwhelming majority of non-recurrent congestion that occurs in this corridor. What is interesting, though, is that this data also indicate that ALDOT could probably operate the patrols in the morning hours and the early afternoon at much lower frequencies than are needed in the afternoon peaks. So again, this would be a pretty interesting or useful data if you were trying to decide not only what hours of the day to deploy service patrols, but also what frequencies do they need to be, and does that need to change during certain times of the day. The same figure on the left for the rural. There you can see most of the congestion occurred actually between 8 and 6. It was very little outside that time. So we plotted total non-recurring congestion delay by TMC. on these maps and compared it to ALDOT's current service patrol deployment zone. So this dashed line here indicates the corridors where ALDOT currently deploys highway service patrols. And when we normalize this then for delay per mile, okay, so total non-recurrent delay per mile, and we compare it to ALDOT's current ASAP deployment, it actually looks pretty good. ALDOT seems to have captured most of the links that have the highest non-recurring delay. There is this one outlying segment at the bottom that looks like it might be in need of some consideration, but overall it looks pretty good. But we then converted those delays per mile to delay cost per mile. And we did that by applying some standard cost factors, about $13 per hour per passenger vehicle and about $90 per hour for a truck to get total cost per mile by TMC that's due to non-recurrent congestion, these links. And you can see when you do that, these southern segments on 65 now appear to be perhaps meriting extending service patrol here based on the cost impact. 65 to the north still looks pretty good, but at least this southern segment of 65 would appear to warrant some further consideration. Now, keep in mind, this would also depend on what factors are chosen for cost. The $90 per hour for a truck cost may in fact be rather low because it really only reflects the cost, operating cost of the truck itself and not necessarily the impact cost of a delayed cargo, say, to a just-in-time manufacturing facility. So that's, I think, a topic for further research. So briefly, general conclusions for the study. We talked about the fact that some of the non-recurrent congestion cannot be attributed to reported incidents. Whether so that if you have a selection criteria or deployment criteria that's dependent on the number of reported incidents, you might be underestimating significantly the amount of non-recurrent congestion that's occurring on a given highway link. We did find that being able to look at the distribution of non-recurrent congestion across days of the week and times of day would be very handy for the deployment, not just for determining times of day for deployment or days of the week for deployment, but also service frequency within those time periods. It also appears that considering the cost of delay, particularly when it's involving trucks or freight movements, could have a significant impact on deployment decisions. And that's certainly something that merits further study. And finally, this study only analyzed 3 months of travel time data. But if this was expanded to 12 months, it would allow you to look at seasonal changes in service patrol, particularly in areas like south of Alabama, where you have a lot of tourism. The last thing I'll say is this method did require a fair amount of work up front in order to clean the data and process the data to get all this. But I think once the system is set up, bringing in a new year's worth of data, the level of effort would actually be fairly small. And I think it could prove very useful that once that initial setup cost is tackled, this could really prove to be a very useful methodology, not only for ALDOT, but for other states.
Right. So let me go to the next research question, which is detecting potential secondary incident. And for that, the data that we used for developing the algorithm, two pieces of data. One is the speed data that we collected from the probe-based speed data vendor called HERE via a platform called Redis. And the speed data is a representation of traffic states, the operating condition for each freeway segment. They call the TMC, or traffic message channel, for each 5-minute period. Then we also got two incident databases that are maintained by the North Carolina Department of Transportation. One is called the Traveler Information Management Systems, and the other one is the archived crash data. So the reason we use two databases is that none of them are actually a full comprehensive incident database. The first one, which is called the TIMS data, it includes all disruptive incidents information, including their start and end time and locations and time. However, incidents with no significant impact on operation, like crashes happening at nighttime without any impact, those are absent in that database. Now, the issue here is that the term significant is a bit vague. A crash can happen at night, but it can still attribute to a secondary crash. So that's the limitation of the TIMS data. On the other hand, the archive crash data are coming from all the police reported crashes. So it doesn't include any construction activities or work zone data. So that's the limitation of that database. Now, when we prepared the data, our initial plan is to fuse these two databases and create a more comprehensive incident database and apply the proposed method on that one. But that seemed to be very challenging because the two databases are coming from two different entities maintain these two databases. One is the traffic operators and the other one is the police. And also their reporting criteria are different, and there were like a lot of discrepancies found in terms of their location and time if we try to compare them. So that's why we had to abandon that plan, and we had to do separate analysis for each data set and compare why we are seeing some differences in the outcome. Also, when we prepared the data, we found that long-term construction activities were creating like an unrealistic number of secondary crashes. So the idea here was to look at the time and distance overlap between each pair of crash and incident, but construction activities that goes beyond days or weeks, they tend to overlap with all the incidents that occurred within that study period, study site and period. So that's why we had to remove these long-term construction activities. Those are not too many, but these two data pre-processing steps suggest that the results that we will see comes with the caveat that we might be missing some incidents. And of course, we had to fuse the incident data with the speed data from here.com. And that's very important because we wanted to look at the speed drop between each pair of incident. And we also wanted to look at like if there was any recurring bottleneck activation close to an incident location and time. All right. So let me explain the method for detecting the potential secondary crashes. The first step is, of course, to filter all the incidents that are happening within the selected study period and time. And then the next step is to apply a filter called the temporal filter. In it, we are trying to look at the temporal relationship between two incidents. So as shown in this diagram here, the red bars represent each incident. And you can see that like the incident I, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. So incident I happened earlier in time than incident J. If there was any overlap, then definitely that incident pair would have passed this filter. But there is a gap here, but that gap is actually less than a certain threshold. And that threshold value, we call it the temporal threshold, depends on the shockwave speed coming from the first incident, right? But because that detailed information is not always available, we will look at the speed data and select a value for that, but we had to go for a fixed value. Let me go to the next one. So once an incident pair passes the second filter, we apply a third filter, which is about the distance between them and the relative direction of the two incidents. So for an incident pair to be primary secondary, two conditions must be met. One is that the start point of the latter incident must be upstream of the former one. And if there is and the gap between them must be less than, again, another threshold, which we call the distance threshold, similar to the time threshold. So in the bottom left diagram, you are seeing again like two incidents, but instead of in time, I'm drawing this in distance. And as you can see, if they had overlapped, then definitely they would have passed through this filter. But the idea here, if they're happening on the same direction, so this is let's assume that there is an interstate highway where you are looking at two incidents that happen on the eastbound direction. If they're happening on the same direction, then the idea here, the assumption here is that the queue is peeling back from the first incident is probably causing the second one. However, if they occur on two different directions, they can still be related to each other, although the queue is not directly impacting the incident on the other direction. So we call this onlooker effect or rubbernecking effect, where if you imagine like an incident is already happening on one side of the road, and the vehicles from the first responders or the queue is attracting the attention of the driver who are on the other side of the road, and that can cause or like partly or fully cause a secondary incident. So that's why we had to look on both sides of the road. And if we measure their distance from the same reference point, the condition they have to meet, these two conditions, if we translate that conditions in mathematical formula, that actually remains the same. The next step is to check if there is any queue between them. Now, we have the speed data from the probe data vendor, which can come from INRIX or here. And we can, once we fuse them with the incident data and plot them in a speed control map like this one, it actually shows us like what's the relative location and time of the speed drop and the incident locations. So this diagram was created using a visualization tool available in Redis, but Redis can only call the Teams incident data. So for the T's, the archive crash data, we had to recreate this visualization using our own method. And that actually creates the same thing, but the data sources are different. So here what you're seeing is that we have two directions of an interstate freeway. The eastbound direction is moving that way, and the speed control plot for that one is on that side. And the other side is the westbound direction. We have on the horizontal axis the time, and on the vertical axis the distance. The two yellow diamond shapes show the occurrence of two incidents that happen like almost at the same location and in quick succession in time. The black line shows their potential impact on the roadway, the start and the end time. Now, the red, the color of the map shows the speed variation. Green means very high speed, and red means as it goes from yellow to red, the speed is actually like less and less. Although there's like a slightly different, the incidents happen slightly down upstream of where we see the first speed drop. That's a big one because it continued for several hours, that speed drop. But it's actually hard to say whether there was an unreported incident that caused these two incidents. Just to remind you that like these data are aggregated or chunked in TMC based. So there is a chance that the start of the congestion is actually on the field happened at the location of the first incident. So here we can see that these two incidents, there is a very good chance that they are related to each other. So we call that like a potential secondary crash where we see there is an evident speed drop or congestion event going on there, right? The last step is to identify the recurring bottlenecks. And this is important because there is no information about demand-induced congestion, or we call like the peak period congestion in the incident database. So a recurring bottleneck activation can cause another incident because of the queue spinning back event. And we have to apply that because for all the events that are in the database, the incidents in the database, some of them could be attributed to this recurring bottlenecks. And it's actually hard to identify those because the Teams or the police crash report doesn't say anything about a bottleneck activation. Now, we used a method developed by earlier studies, and this diagram explains the method, but I will not go into the detail of this process, how we applied this method to all the segments that we have. In short, we got the speed data for all the TMCs and period, and we looked at whether a particular time and space was congested for 33% of all the analysis days. So that would indicate that's a potential, that's a recurring bottleneck location and time. And the way we define congested condition is simply based on 70% of the free flow speed drop. And if that speed drop sustained for 15 minutes or more, we call that as a congested event. So that's how we identified recurring bottleneck location and fused with the incident data. So we applied these steps to our case study site, which is a 31-mile long of I-40/85 in North Carolina. It runs between the from the eastern side of the Greensboro Beltline to the city of Hillsboro. And we collected both the TIMS data and the crash data for over a 6 months period, but they don't overlap because the TIMS database was not comprehensive, and also the speed data was not available for the year of 2015, for which we got the clean crash data courtesy to the NCDOT safety team. Now, this table shows the categorization of the TIMS database. Most of the incidents were confirmed crashes, and other major categories are unconfirmed crashes and maintenance. Of course, we had a lot more crashes than in the crash data from the police reports than we have in the TIMS database for the same period. The reason being, as I said, not all the crashes were included in the TIMS database because they didn't create any significant disruptive impact on the traffic operation. This table shows the results after applying these steps for identifying potential primary-secondary pairs. So if we look at the TIMS database, in total, there were 50 pairs of potential primary-secondary incidents identified out of 169 incidents. For the thresholds, we looked at the speed drop pattern and a time threshold of 1 hour and the distance threshold for the entire corridor length, deemed the most reasonable one. We used the entire corridor length because in many cases we saw that an incident actually caused traffic disruption throughout the entire 30-mile stretch of the road, 31-mile stretch of the road. So those, like, not all the incidents caused that, but there are several cases which led us to choose such a long distance threshold for that. But this threshold should be tuned for any other case study site. Now, for the crash database, there were 328 crashes, and out of that, there are like 59 primary-secondary pairs. Of all these pairs, only a few, like 3 of them in both cases, were found to be like on the opposite direction. So those could be attributed to an onlooker effect. If we look at the percentage identified compared to the total, the TIMS database has like a higher percentage. Again, that's probably attributed to the fact that most of the incidents in the TIMS database did create a significant impact on the traffic operation. And once we looked at the Q data between each pair of identified incidents, we found that 61% of the for 61% of the primary-secondary pairs that we found from the crash database had queued condition. That number is 76%, which is slightly higher in the TIMS database for the same reason. One caveat about this result is that we didn't find any recurring bottleneck in that study area, but definitely if we look at other study areas such as which are prone to recurring bottlenecks, like the Greensboro Beltline or the Raleigh Beltline in North Carolina, definitely we had to apply that method to all the crashes, all the incidents, and that would probably create a higher number of primary-secondary incident pair. So this is an example of all the primary-secondary pairs that we identified. So we actually created these plots for all the potential pairs, but we are not going to show all the plots here. This is an interesting case where there was like a significant traffic disruption going on slightly earlier than the reported time and slightly downstream than the reported location of the first incident here. But there is a chance that there is an unreported incident here. But given the database, this is our primary and this is our secondary, because those are happening. There's a significant overlap both in time and distance. There is also a third one here, which looks like an isolated event. But the reason is that the time difference is very large. The if you look at the shock wave or the speed drop, it's actually hard to say if the traffic state was actually fully recovered or not. There is a chance that if we see like sometimes there are like crest and sag on the traffic geometry, in which cases the drivers don't have much sight distance, that can cause the traffic condition to be continued in a force flow condition, even if we see that the speed was close to free flow speed in some time and space. So it's actually hard to make a call about this one, but given the algorithm and the thresholds, this is considered as an isolated event. So the last piece of calculation is about the L-dot method that Professor Sullivan just described. If we apply that method, because we have all the crash data and the AADT data, does it tell us that we need service petrol need in this area based on the incident frequency and AADT? Now, we actually already have a service petrol deployed in this area, which is called the IMAP service petrol. And in this map, the balloons are showing the tentative location of the deployment, although they're like showing a fixed point, but these service petrols move significantly. So we can safely say that it's already been undercover by this IMAP program. And if we look at the incident factor, the estimated factor for this corridor was about 12. L-dot used a threshold of 4. So we are way above that threshold. Based on that threshold, we can say that this deployment is justified. All right. So in summary, we looked at the incident databases and speed data to develop a framework for shortlisting potential primary secondary incident pairs. Now, this comes with the condition that the reporting criteria and data quality are very important factors for detecting these crashes. We tried to apply the same method to another interstate, which is the Beltline of Atlanta, Georgia, but we found that that road network is very dense, a lot of parallel roads running with the interstates, and the crash locations and incident locations, if those are not correct, many of those incidents that actually happened on these side roads were attributed to the freeway segment. And that actually led to a huge overestimation of secondary crash rates. So we need to be careful about the reporting criteria of incidents and the data quality in terms of the incident location and time. The two buffer thresholds that we use, the time and distance buffer threshold, are also very important variables. And for any other site, those need to be readjusted. Of course, in our study, we had to set up a boundary condition. Incidents occurring outside that boundary conditions and long-term construction activities, as I said earlier, were not considered. So that's another issue that needs to be addressed. If we have a road where outside of the network there is like another urban setups, which is true in our case. The IMAP service petrol is justified according to the L-dot method, but again, the threshold that L-dot is using might not be applicable to the North Carolina roads. So for any kind of threshold-based method like this one, we need to readjust it for probably using the statewide road data or some other methods. So some recommendations for future research. So this is the last slide, and we are right at 1 o'clock. Estimating the congestion cost for freight vehicles, the L-dot study that showed it's important need further study. And of course, the crash description for identifying any primary cause is really important. So we didn't look at the crash description that are available from the police report data. However, many state agencies are now restricting the access for researchers to those data. But if we have access to those, we could use a text recognition algorithm to find more information about like whether there was a primary reason involved in a crash. And the effects of recurring congestion on crash occurrence, we couldn't show the application because there was no recurring bottleneck, but it's really an important piece of analysis because demand-induced congestion and peak hour crashes are common in many urban settings. Of course, this secondary crash detection method, if we can detect the secondary crash with sufficient accuracy for all the sites, then that can be added as a potential benefit assessment metric for all the TSMI strategies. All right, so we are done with the presentation. Jennifer, I'm not sure like how you want to handle the questionnaire session right now. We are right at our 1 o'clock end time. So I think we need to, we can have a shortened questionnaire session, but I will leave it up to you.
Sure, you can go ahead and ask questions.
So I'm gonna open the floor for the audience, and Jennifer, if you can check if the audience can unmute themselves and speak up. All right, I think we don't have any question from the audience. However, what we can do is that this presentation will be made available via Stride, and there will be a YouTube link posted in the there will be a YouTube video in the Stride YouTube channel. If you have any question about the two research questions that we addressed or any of the topic, we can you can always reach out to myself or Professor Sullivan. And let me reshare my screen. Couldn't put it in the chat box, but since this session is recorded, you can always reach out to myself and Professor Sullivan if you have any question.